What awaited them wasn't fear nor surrender. It was a united people, silent, steadfast, ready for this moment, and a commander whose knowledge of ice and terrain would turn an unstoppable invasion into a frozen nightmare. The fate of entire territories balanced on a knife's edge. Today, you'll discover how a frozen lake became the deadliest weapon in medieval history, one that killed not with steel, but with physics. April 5th, 1242. Early spring in the borderlands between Russia and Crusader-held territories. Lake Peipus, a massive sheet of frozen water stretching for miles, still looked solid. But the spring sun was quietly doing its work. Beneath that white, deceptively solid surface, physics was setting a death trap. 12,000 Crusader Knights of the Teutonic Order sank in a single day. Full-plate knights, the most feared warriors in Europe, swallowed by icy waters in a matter of minutes. The question that echoed through the following centuries was simple. How did a frozen lake become the deadliest battlefield in history? The answer begins weeks earlier, when the forces of the Teutonic Order marched north with absolute confidence. This was no ordinary religious order. It was a professional military machine, trained since childhood for one purpose: conquest through the force of heavy cavalry. Every Teutonic Knight represented years of intensive training, full-plate armor forged by master German smiths, and a warhorse worth more than an entire peasant's house. They had momentum on their side. One Baltic territory after another fell. Strongholds that had stood for generations crumbled under waves of armored cavalry and siege warfare. The order didn't just win battles, it obliterated resistance. But Alexander Nevsky, Prince of Novgorod, was different. At 32, he'd already repelled Swedish invasions and defended Russian lands against far larger forces. His reputation wasn't built on raw power. It was built on something far more dangerous: reading the terrain like a chessboard and using it as a weapon. The Russian forces under his command were numerically inferior. Fewer knights, lighter armor, fewer resources. On paper, it was a foregone conclusion. The Teutonic Order advanced with the certainty of those who had won before the battle even began. Armor that could withstand direct arrow hits, horses trained to charge through enemy lines, formations that had broken entire armies. But Nevsky understood something the Crusaders couldn't see. He knew that lake. He knew how the ice behaved in spring. He knew the weight it could bear and, more importantly, the weight it could not. The Teutonic Order saw a perfect stage for their cavalry charges. Nevsky saw a mousetrap waiting to snap shut. Lake Peipus was not just any lake. It was a natural border between Russian territories and the lands conquered by the Crusaders. Massive, stretching for miles in all directions, frozen for months during the region's harsh winter. But April brought subtle changes. The sun rose higher in the sky. The air temperature gradually increased, and beneath the white surface, the ice began to lose its crystalline structure. The Russians who lived in those lands understood the lake's cycles. They knew that the ice in the center, where the water was deepest, weakened first. They knew that the distributed weight of a man on foot could be supported, but the concentrated pressure of armored horses and heavy armor created a deadly risk. The Teutonic Crusaders, from warmer southern territories, had no such knowledge. To them, ice was simple, either solid or broken. They didn't grasp the nuances. Nevsky turned this ignorance into his most powerful weapon. The mathematics of medieval warfare were brutal and simple. A Teutonic Knight in full armor weighed approximately 90 kilograms. The plate armor added another 25 to 30 kilograms. The warhorse, a massive animal bred specifically to carry this weight in combat, weighed between 600 and 700 kilograms. Combined, each cavalry unit represented between 700 and 800 kilograms of concentrated weight on the horse's hooves. When thousands of these units advanced in close formation, the total weight on the lake's surface became astronomical. The Russian forces, by contrast, wore lighter armor, chainmail instead of full plate, smaller, more agile horses. The total weight per Russian knight was 30 to 40% less than their Teutonic counterparts. In direct combat, this was a disadvantage. On fragile ice, it was the difference between life and death. Nevsky didn't just understand this difference. He planned his entire strategy around it. The plan began to take shape weeks before the battle. Nevsky positioned his forces along the eastern shore of Lake Peipus, in areas where the ice remained thicker due to the shallower water. His troops occupied solid ground, their backs protected by firm land with clear retreat routes. But he didn't build fortifications. He didn't create obvious barriers. On the contrary, his forces looked vulnerable, exposed. A smaller force, seemingly unprepared, camped in a weak defensive position. It was the perfect bait. Nevsky's strategy relied on a simple premise: to make the Crusaders charge exactly where he wanted them. The center of the lake, where the water was deepest, where the spring ice was thinnest, where the weight of the Teutonic cavalry would become their own executioner. But how to make an experienced army make such a mistake? The answer lay in the psychology of conquest. The Teutonic Order was not accustomed to retreating. Their military success was based on psychological momentum as much as on physical strength. When they saw a vulnerable enemy force, they attacked. When they identified an opportunity to crush resistance quickly, they did not hesitate. Nevsky offered exactly this illusion. Visible Russian forces, seemingly disorganized, occupying a position that seemed easy to outflank across the lake. For Teutonic commanders accustomed to quick victories, it was irresistible. The order advanced with absolute confidence. Thousands of knights in a wedge formation, the classic Teutonic tactic. Armor gleaming under the April sun, black and white banners fluttering in the cold wind. The sound of hooves on ice echoed across the frozen plain like distant thunder. They did not know that every step led them deeper into the trap. As the Teutonic formation advanced across the lake, the weight began to do its work. Subtle sounds began to emerge from the ice surface. Low cracks, small fissures too tiny to be seen, but large enough to be heard. Water began to appear where the pressure was greatest, small puddles forming under the horses' hooves. The most experienced knights probably noticed. But momentum was a powerful force. Thousands of men and horses in coordinated movement do not stop easily, and the Russian force ahead seemed so close, so vulnerable. Nevsky kept his forces steady, silent, watching thousands of armored knights pile onto the weakest ice. Each second added more weight, more strain on ice that was already failing. And then it snapped. Nevsky did not need to give the order to attack. Physics had already delivered the sentence. What the Teutonic Crusaders believed to be a battlefield was, in fact, a frozen death sentence waiting to be executed. The first cracks were small, fine lines running across the white surface like frozen lightning. But when the ice began to give way, the progression was exponential. One crack connected to another. Entire sheets of ice began to separate, and under the combined weight of thousands of armored knights, the surface of Lake Peipus began to collapse. Chaos erupted. Fully armored knights struggling to stay upright on crumbling ice. Horses screaming, their hooves punching through the surface as freezing water flooded in. Everything that had made them invincible on land, the weight, the armor, the sheer mass now dragged them down like anchors. Full-plate armor was designed for one thing: repelling swords and arrows. It wasn't designed for water. Once submerged, it became a suit of lead. Knights who went through the ice didn't struggle. They sank. The wedge formation that had crushed armies on solid ground became a death funnel. The front ranks broke through. Those behind, still charging, plowed straight into open water and drowning men. And Alexander Nevsky watched as the lake did the work that no army could accomplish. 12,000 of Europe's finest warriors, drowning in waters barely 5 degrees Celsius. Armor that took months to forge, dragging men to the bottom of a lake that would become their collective tomb. What the Teutonic Crusaders thought was a battlefield was, in fact, a trap. And the commander they underestimated had turned nature itself into his most lethal weapon. Nevsky's order was not to attack. It was to retreat. The Russian lines fell back from the eastern shore, their banners rippling in the wind. The Teutonic Knights saw exactly what they expected to see: victory. The enemy was retreating. That could only mean one thing: the Russians were breaking. But this apparent defeat was doing exactly what Nevsky had planned all along: controlling where the Crusaders moved. With every meter the Russians retreated towards the eastern shore, the Crusaders advanced further into the center of the lake. Thousands of fully armored knights, each weighing between 60 and 100 kilograms, mounted on war horses that easily weighed 400 kilograms. The formations concentrated, compacting as they pursued what they believed to be a fleeing enemy. And the closer they got to the center of Lake Peipus, the deeper they entered the zone of weaker ice. It was April 5th, 1242. The morning temperature was already rising. The spring sun shone on the white surface of the lake, slowly warming layers of ice that had spent months forming during the harshest winter. But now, in early spring, these layers began to give way. The first signs were almost imperceptible. A crack here, a fissure there. Small sounds lost in the clang of armor. The horses, the war cries of the Crusaders, who believed themselves moments away from a decisive victory. Nevsky had chosen the exact moment, not a week earlier, when the ice was still too solid. Not a week later, when the lake would have already visibly started to melt. He chose the perfect day, when the ice looked resilient but was structurally compromised underneath. And now, thousands of Teutonic warriors were concentrated in a zone roughly 100 meters wide, exactly where the ice was weakest. The combined weight exceeded the load limit that frozen surface could bear. The cracking sounds grew louder. Jagged cracks spiderwebbed across the white surface. Water seeped through the fissures, soaking the horses' hooves, creeping up the armor joints. And then it failed completely. It wasn't gradual. It was instantaneous. Entire sections of frozen surface dropped away all at once, swallowing knights in clusters. The sound was deafening. Ice splitting like gunshots, followed immediately by the screams of men and horses falling into black water below. The knights leading the pursuit simply vanished. One moment they were galloping toward the Russians, the next, the ground beneath them turned into water. The heavy armor that made them invincible in land combat now became anchors dragging them to the bottom of the lake. 60 kilograms of metal and leather, 100 kilos in some cases. All designed to protect against swords and spears, but completely useless against the unforgiving physics of freezing water. They tried to swim. They couldn't. Arms locked inside rigid metal. The water nearly freezing paralyzed muscles in seconds. Horses thrashed, dragged under by the weight of riders they couldn't shake. The lake swallowed them by the thousand in minutes, converting cavalry formations into mass graves. And it was in this moment of absolute chaos that Nevsky's true genius became clear. The ice hadn't failed by accident. Nevsky had calculated exactly where and when it would give way. This wasn't a battle. It was physics weaponized. Nevsky didn't gamble. He'd studied that lake. He knew its patterns through years of winters. He understood that the deepest center always melted first. He calculated that spring warmth would weaken the ice just enough to make it deadly under tons of armor, but not enough for foreign Crusaders to detect the danger. And he'd orchestrated it all. The Crusaders weren't defeated. They were herded into exactly the spot where he wanted them to die. But the initial collapse was just the beginning of the Teutonic catastrophe. Panic spread faster than fire. The knights who were still on solid ice saw their front formations disappear and tried to flee. They retreated desperately toward the western shore from where they had come. But every gallop created more pressure on already failing ice. Every step they took made it worse. They couldn't retreat without breaking more sections beneath them. Panic fed the destruction. Men who survived the first collapse fell through the second. Some made it to a third patch only to plunge through that one too. Each wave of chaos triggered the next. It was a chain reaction they couldn't stop. Those who managed to stay on solid surfaces faced a new problem. The Russians. Nevsky's forces, still on the solid eastern shore, now advanced. They wore light armor designed for ice, not for blocking swords. They knew the lake's geography by heart. They knew where the ice would hold their weight and where it would collapse under an armored man. They showed no mercy. Exhausted, soaked, panicked Teutonic Knights were slaughtered while struggling toward shore. Others were driven back into weak ice zones, where they vanished beneath black water. Minutes earlier, the Crusaders thought they were winning. Now they were being slaughtered. And with each death came another revelation of Nevsky's genius. Because the Russian retreat wasn't cowardice. It was the second phase of a perfectly orchestrated trap. Nevsky had herded thousands of Crusaders like cattle, making them believe in victory while they walked toward annihilation. The third layer was timing. Nevsky could have fought in January when the ice was solid, or February, still safe. But he waited for April, the precise moment when spring had weakened the ice just enough to be lethal under armored weight, but not obviously cracked enough for Crusaders to suspect danger. The fourth layer, force distribution. While Crusaders piled into the lake's center, concentrating all their weight into one kill zone, Russians stayed spread along the solid shore. They never took the risk because Nevsky never gave them a reason to. This wasn't luck. It wasn't providence. It wasn't fate favoring the Russians. It was a commander who understood that war isn't just about swords and courage. It's about physics, timing, psychology, and the relentless use of every available advantage. Nevsky hadn't just won a battle. He had turned the environment into a weapon. He had used the Crusaders' own weight against them. He had turned their reliance on heavy armor into a death sentence. He had transformed a military advantage into a fatal vulnerability. And when silence finally fell over Lake Peipus, the magnitude of the Teutonic disaster was undeniable. Chronicles record approximately 12,000 dead. Crusaders, knights, professional soldiers. Some drowned in seconds, dragged down by armor they couldn't escape. Others died slowly in the water, their muscles locked by cold, trying desperately to reach shore that kept receding. Many were cut down by Russians as they stumbled and panicked. Survivor accounts describe horror beyond measure. Men calling for help as ice continued to collapse beneath them. Knights clawing at armor buckles with numb fingers, unable to undo them as hypothermia set in. Entire units simply vanishing beneath the surface. Bubbles. Red water. Nothing else. But beneath the tactical brilliance lay a brutal truth. Thousands of men didn't die in battle. They died in the water, paralyzed by cold, unable to move or fight back. Not the honorable death they expected. Not combat. Just drowning in black ice water. And when the sun finally began to set over Lake Peipus that evening of April 5th, the frozen surface was silent, still. Bodies trapped beneath the ice, invisible but present. The Russian victory was total and absolute. The Teutonic Order stopped dead. Their grand plan of eastward conquest, the whole reason they'd invaded, died on Lake Peipus. No more offensives into Russian territory. No more threats to Novgorod. The eastern border was locked down, not for years, for generations. And Alexander Nevsky became a legend overnight. He wasn't just a good commander anymore. He was the man who understood something his enemies couldn't grasp. That a frozen lake could be more lethal than an army. That physics could defeat knights. That understanding your environment beats having the biggest sword. But the consequences went far beyond a single battle. Because what happened on Lake Peipus in 1242 wasn't just a military victory. It was a historical turning point whose shockwaves would echo for centuries. And the questions that remained were as deep as the lake itself. What if the Crusaders had won? What if Nevsky hadn't understood the mechanics of the ice? What if the Teutonic forces had continued their march east, conquering Russian territory after territory? The history of Eastern Europe would have been completely different. But it wasn't. And the reason lies frozen beneath the waters of Lake Peipus, where thousands of knights learned too late that war is not won by courage and armor alone. Sometimes, it is won by a commander who understands that the environment can be the deadliest weapon of all, and that true genius lies not in fighting harder, but in making the enemy fight exactly where and when you want them to. This wasn't just a battle. It was a lesson that would echo through the centuries, changing how military commanders thought about terrain, timing, and environmental tactics. And it all started with a man who looked at a frozen lake and saw not just ice, but a weapon waiting to be activated. The geopolitical impact was immediate and devastating for the Teutonic Order. The Crusaders' eastward expansion, which seemed inevitable just weeks prior, was permanently halted. The Teutonic Knights, who had conquered Prussia and threatened to swallow Russian lands, now looked upon the frozen lake with horror. The strategy of expansion through forced conversion and military domination simply stopped. There would be no more major incursions into Novgorod territories. The ice didn't just kill 12,000 men, it froze the European advance in the east for generations. Novgorod's safety was guaranteed. The Russian lands, protected by the genius of a single commander, breathed a sigh of relief. Villages that expected to be burned remained intact. Families that expected to be enslaved continued their lives. And all because Alexander Nevsky understood something his enemies ignored. The environment can be more lethal than any army. Nevsky's rise was meteoric. From military commander, he became a national savior. His reputation wasn't built just on victories, it was built on impossible victories. Defeating the Swedes on the banks of the Neva River in 1240. Crushing the Teutonic Knights on a frozen lake in 1242. These weren't just battles won. They were tactical miracles that defied all military logic of the time. European commanders took notice. For the first time, military strategists seriously studied climate and terrain as weapons, not just as obstacles. Lake Peipus became the case study that would echo through centuries of military academies. How did a smaller force crush a superior one using nothing but ice and timing? That question haunted Europe. For decades afterward, the Teutonic Knights didn't come back. The lake had terrified them. The border held. The Orthodox East stayed separate from the Catholic West. And when Nevsky died in 1263, at only 42, he wasn't just mourned as a prince, he was sainted. Not for religious reasons, for saving an entire nation without fighting in the traditional sense. With intelligence, with understanding. But the true legacy of the battle on the ice wasn't in the past. It was in the future. Because what Nevsky did on that frozen day in April 1242 wasn't just win a battle. It was to create a model, a doctrine, a way of thinking about war that would transform the very Russian identity. The doctrinal shift was profound. Medieval commanders, previously obsessed with heavy cavalry and direct confrontations, began to account for terrain and climate as real tactical weapons. It was no longer enough to have the best knights or the toughest armor. It was necessary to know the battlefield better than the enemy. It was necessary to understand when rain became mud, when ice became a trap, when the forest became an ambush. And the principle never died. In 1939, Finland faced the Soviet Union 300,000 soldiers against 5 million. They used Nevsky's playbook. Know your land better than the invader. Finnish snipers in white camouflage hunted Soviet columns trapped on narrow roads through forests. The winter was their weapon. Nevsky would have recognized the strategy instantly. Then came 1941. Hitler invaded Russia. He had the same advantages the Teutonic Knights had: better equipment, bigger numbers, professional training. Russia had the same advantage Nevsky had: the environment. The Russian winter killed more Germans than bullets. Tanks froze, soldiers froze. The cold was impassable. Hitler didn't know it, but he was replaying a 700-year-old battle he'd already lost. Nevsky's principles survived. Vietnam learned them. Afghanistan learned them. The lesson never changed. Know your environment better than your enemy, and his advantages become his death sentence. And Lake Peipus became the archetypal case study, the definitive example of environment beats equipment. Modern military academies still teach this battle. Not for the details of medieval formations, but for the eternal principle: to underestimate the terrain is to underestimate death. But here's the revelation few realize. Nevsky's tactic wasn't forgotten. It became Russia's standard defensive strategy. It wasn't an isolated historical accident. It was the foundation of a military doctrine that persists to this day. The idea of luring invaders into the interior, stretching them beyond their supply lines, and letting winter do the heavy lifting. Napoleon learned this the hard way in 1812. Hitler learned it in 1941-1945. And it all started with a 21-year-old prince who understood physics better than his enemies understood war. So, what are the real principles we can extract from this battle? The tactical lessons that transcend eras and technologies? First, know your ground better than the enemy. Nevsky studied that lake for years. He knew where the ice was thin. He knew the water depth. He knew how cavalry weight concentrated. Crusaders saw a frozen surface. Nevsky saw a weapon. Victory or defeat came down to centimeters of ice and hours of spring thaw. Second, turn your weakness into their weakness. Nevsky's lighter armor was supposed to be a disadvantage. On the ice, it became an advantage. His men distributed their weight. They moved faster. While Crusaders sank, Russians ran. What looked like inferior equipment became tactical superiority. Never accept the battlefield on the enemy's terms. Third, multiply through environment. Nevsky didn't kill 12,000 men himself. The ice did. Every Russian soldier he deployed was worth 10 Crusaders, not because they fought better, but because the terrain fought with them. When your environment aligns with your strategy, you don't add strength, you multiply it exponentially. Fourth, patience. Nevsky could have fought when the ice was solid, but he waited. For the perfect moment when spring had weakened it, just enough dangerous, but not obviously. That surgical timing mattered as much as any sword. Sometimes, winning is about waiting for nature to take your side. These aren't just military lessons. They are principles of life, of business, of any situation where you face stronger adversaries. And this is where Nevsky becomes more than a medieval commander. He becomes a symbol of intelligence winning over brute force. The Russian Orthodox Church didn't just honor him. They sainted him, not for theology, for genius, for saving an entire nation with his mind. He became a saint and a general, at once proof that intelligence could be as divine as prayer. Nevsky became immortal. Peter the Great created the Order of Alexander Nevsky in 1725, almost 500 years after his death, making it one of Russia's highest honors. Ironically, Napoleon received this order in 1807, right before invading Russia. He wore the name of the man whose doctrine would break him. He didn't know it, but he was already defeated. In 1938, with Nazi threat looming, Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein made a film, Alexander Nevsky. It was propaganda. Stalin sent a message: invaders from the West always lose. The Teutonic Knights in the film looked like Nazis. Nevsky looked like salvation. The subtext was clear. Russia had crushed Europe before. It would do it again. In 2008, Russians voted on their greatest historical figure. Not Lenin, not Stalin, not Peter the Great. They chose Nevsky, a medieval prince who defeated superior forces by understanding ice. That choice says everything. Russians remember the man who proved that intelligence beats strength, that understanding beats armor, that one brilliant mind can change history. That's the epitaph, the prince who understood ice. Not the biggest army, not advanced weapons, just knowledge, patience. Physics turned into a weapon. Today, Lake Peipus freezes and thaws like any other winter. Fishermen work the ice. Tourists photograph the spot where 12,000 men died. The lake is calm now. It doesn't remember 1242. But we do, because that ice wasn't random. It was the grave of an empire, the birth of a doctrine, proof that understanding your ground beats having a bigger sword. Every spring, Lake Peipus offers the same warning: underestimate the environment, and it kills you. So what's the lesson? What does a medieval lake battle actually teach us in 2025? 12,000 people died because one man understood physics better than his enemies. Not tactics, not luck. Physics. Pure science, pressure, weight, ice. That's the core truth. Intelligence can beat weapons. Knowledge beats armor. Understanding how the world works beats being stronger than your opponent. Small forces beat big ones through intelligence, not muscle. Nevsky's soldiers weren't better warriors. They had worse equipment, fewer men, but they had knowledge. That knowledge gave every Russian soldier an edge that made them worth 10 Crusaders. The lake became his ally. Spring became his weapon. Never underestimate local knowledge. The Crusaders saw ice as terrain. Nevsky saw it as a grave. That difference between assuming and understanding was the difference between crushing invaders and being crushed yourself. But here's the deepest truth. The ice didn't win. Nevsky did. Without him, without his timing, without his understanding, the ice would just be ice. A frozen lake. He turned it into a weapon. He turned nature into a killing field through pure genius. The ice was the tool. His mind was the weapon. That is the emotional resolution that ties up all narrative threads. A battle from 783 years ago still resonates because it touches on eternal truths. Intelligence beats strength. Knowledge beats equipment. Patience beats aggression. And one man, in the right place, at the right moment, with the right understanding, can change the course of history. But how does this apply today? How does a medieval battle connect with your life in 2025? In business, you're fighting a bigger competitor. More money, more reach. You can't win their way. But if you understand your customers better, know their pain points, strike at the right moment, then you're Nevsky. They're the Crusaders. Your market is the ice. Knowledge beats capital. At work. You want a promotion. Someone else has more experience, better connections, a fancier resume. You can't beat them on credentials, but you understand what your boss actually needs. You know the real problems the company faces. You time your moves perfectly. That beats experience every time. In life, the best advantage is the invisible one. Your enemy sees what's obvious. You see what's hidden. The Crusaders saw cavalry tactics. Nevsky saw melting ice. One was visible. One killed them. That's the core message. You don't need to be the strongest. You need to be the smartest. Understand your environment. Turn weakness into advantage. Time your moves perfectly. Here's my question for you. What other impossible victories interest you? Thermopylae? Vietnam? Some battle you know that shouldn't have gone the way it did? Comment below. I read every comment, and you shape which battles we analyze next. If you learned something about how one person's intelligence beat thousands of trained knights, hit like. Share this with someone who underestimates their underdog position. Subscribe for more battles like this. More moments where knowledge defeated strength. Where planning beat force. Where the smaller force crushed the larger one through pure genius. It happened April 5th, 1242. But the lessons? They're active right now. Every time you face someone bigger. Every time you use brains instead of brawn. Every time you make your environment work for you, you're Nevsky. And every spring, Lake Peipus repeats the lesson. Ignore local knowledge and you drown. Use it, and the environment becomes your weapon. Thanks for watching. See you in the next impossible victory.